Hi, Ian. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
My name is Mariko Silver, and I'm the president and CEO of the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm thrilled to be here today with Ian Solomon. Ian is the dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. He is a lawyer, a teacher of negotiation, conflict resolution, and collaboration. Ian served in the U.S. Senate as legislative counsel to then Senator Barack Obama, and later as executive director for the World Bank Group. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Henry Luce Foundation. It's nice to see you, Ian.
It's great to be here.
So thank you for taking the time to talk with us about leadership today. Obviously, this is something that you know a lot about, both from personal experience and from your work in the academy, from your work leading the Batten School. I've had the pleasure of hearing you talk about leadership and your approach to leadership now over many years. It's been enormously informative and helpful and supportive to me. And I really wanted to just take this opportunity, particularly around the 50th anniversary of the Luce Scholars Program, which is, as you know, a leadership program that sends 18 young people to Asia for work placements and language training every year, to places with which they are unfamiliar or largely unfamiliar, and they have an immersive leadership experience. Not because they're leading organizations necessarily, but because they are learning what within themselves enables them to lead, regardless of whether they have, as you have said, positional leadership or not. So I wanted us to talk today a little bit about what you view as the developmental qualities of leadership, not just looking, as I know you also do, at what qualities strong, capable, thoughtful leaders have, also for us to think a little bit about how they get there. So if we could start with a little bit more about you than I could include in that short bio, about your version, however you want to tell it, of how you got where you are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariko. It's great to be with you and to have had the opportunity to learn from you, watching you work, to have these conversations with you. I think what I'm always inspired by is your deep curiosity, and I think that's actually a really core muscle that we ought to develop. Now, for many of us who may have a certain level that we have naturally, but we ought to develop this curiosity muscle to understand ourselves, to understand other people, to understand the contexts in which we operate and what might be the purpose of exercising leadership. I've been curious about lots of these things about how do we learn to coexist as a species. One of the things that hurts me physically is watching how cruel we can sometimes be, and our habitual tendencies to appear to be habitual to go to war with each other and take this amazing earth we have and use so many of its resources really to try to hurt others and cause suffering. And yet, I can also observe the potential of cooperation. And like, you look at cities of tens of millions of people, many of which your Luce scholars visit in Asia. And how does a city actually work? It's actually an amazing feat of enormous coordination and cooperation and trust by people to live 100 stories in a building designed by someone, and to think about the innovations in healthcare and medicine, like collaborative science and discovery over generations. So we have both these features of extraordinary cooperation capabilities and potential, as well as extraordinary destructive capabilities. So I've been fascinated by this, and the leadership that inspires me is leadership that is able to take our vast differences and different preferences as a species and our amazing similarities and relative sameness, the same basic core needs of all of us, and achieve things that are meaningful. Right, to take people, as I look at, I spent time in South Africa during the first election of Nelson Mandela in 1994.
And this was a study abroad program that you went on?
So it was my own study abroad. I went to do what was originally going to be 2 months of summer research for my undergraduate thesis. And a few weeks after I got there, they set a date for an election about 10 months later. And I said, why would I go back to school now? I'll have a richer, more surprising, more complicated, more experiential education staying in South Africa. So I spent a year there leading up the election, and then came home after the election, and had to go back to school. But and part of what I'm trying to do with the Batten School is create opportunities like the Luce Scholars Program has done, which is how do we create global experiences where people get out of their comfort zone, have to go immerse themselves in another culture, another society, different food, different language, different social interaction habits, different sources of news and information, different smells, sights, sounds, music, recreation, etc. So I think you can learn a lot about yourself and about this broad, wonderful world by doing that. So that was in some ways that was my first overseas trip, the first time I needed a passport. And the lessons then, the inspiration then, the example of Mandela as a negotiator, problem solver, collaborator, leader, really profound in probably everything I've done since.
Yeah, what an extraordinary time to be there. I mean, I almost can't imagine it. In fact, I can't imagine it, and I don't know that it's imaginable if you didn't experience it.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, because you can't read about something like that and really experience it, right? I mean, reading about it is great, and I think people should study history. I think we need things written and need things read. But I do think that one of the most important ways of developing leadership is by doing, by being. We of course, we have students study a lot of the theories of social psychology and human behavior and leadership theories. But among the most important education comes when you're trying to achieve something, and that something requires the cooperation of others. And you have to figure out, okay, how do I motivate this cooperation of someone to help create something? How do I empower them to do what they need to do in this relationship? How do I empower myself? When do I need to take the initiative? When do I need to inspire someone else to take the initiative? When is my leadership about a decision that I have to make? When is it about creating space for someone else to make a decision, right? There are all these different aspects that are, I think, all figure into kind of exercising leadership effectively. Although not all those decisions in every one context, but I think the leaders I admire have shown the ability to kind of navigate through different situations, different constituencies, different contexts, different objectives, to improve the world.
Can we circle back to curiosity, and can you talk a little bit about your take on the role of curiosity in enabling all of those different leadership stances and engagements that you just described? I mean, from the Luce Scholars point of view, when we revamped Luce Scholars and really re-articulated our mission, one of the things that we pointed to as a core element is exploratory curiosity. That's one of the major things that we are looking for when we're looking and interviewing Luce Scholar candidates. It's one of the main things that we want the Luce program to cultivate as a lifelong practice, is an orientation that centers exploratory curiosity. And I would love to hear you talk about why, from your point of view, coming to this from a different vantage point, why that's important.
Yeah, I probably get there from my work in conflict resolution. Because when you have the answer, or you believe you have the answer, you're basically closed. Right? You're trying to give someone the explanation, the answer. You kind of you think you know where you're going. And I'm motivated very much by by some of the theories in Zen Buddhism, this notion of not knowing. And when I'm in a place of not knowing, I'm open. I'm willing to hear your ideas. I'm willing to explore your solutions to this problem. And too often we come in, and again, I'm in a higher education institution. Higher education institutions very well. We love to have the answer. We think the answer is something we can discover and we can put out there and we can test. And I'm a big believer in scientific discovery and creating hypotheses and getting data and being able to predict patterns in the world. So I'm not opposed to finding answers, but I think our orientation should be about, what don't I know here? What can I learn here? What can an attitude or mindset of exploratory curiosity expose me to that I didn't know before? And I don't know about you, I suspect that the more you've learned about anything you've actually started to study, you've been overwhelmed of feeling like how much you've yet to know. And the more you know, the more you realize how little you know, how many layers you have not yet uncovered. So to me, you know, I consider myself not an expert on leadership, but a student of leadership, because the more I try to think about the different facets and see what my colleagues have uncovered with their research in social psychology, the more I realize, ooh, there's more I've yet to figure out. And if we want to be cultivating leaders to work in large organizations or support large institutions or help to bridge divides and create peace in this world, I think we want more of them to be open, not closed, to be able to be about what's the question I should ask as opposed to what's the answer I should give.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And combining that with the experiential learning focus really creates a different kind of, hopefully lifelong substrate for bringing in new information and new information and new information. And I'm curious how that lands with the Batten School students, because like Luce scholars, I'm assuming they're all high achievers. They have come up in a system that is really oriented towards them knowing the answer or being able to please the audience with the right answer or the right articulation, even of a problem or a question. And so being right has a lot of value in the educational system through which they have grown up. And then here they are, and you're asking them to not focus on being right as a primary goal, to focus on being open. And it's one of the things that I love about the way that you talk about leadership, the way you talk about your own leadership, whether it's with students or I heard you do it with alumni. And it's a very different model of leadership than the kind of hierarchical or the phalanx idea or the a lot of the kind of military metaphors that we often use for leadership, or even sports teams metaphors that we often use for leadership. You talk about art, you talk about improvisation, and you talk about the capacity to embrace and engage those things. And I heard you talk to a group of students and you started talking about jazz and knowing how to listen. But my guess is that while they may have an impulse or an instinct in that direction, maybe that's part of why they're at your school instead of somewhere else, it's not necessarily something that they have grown up seeing in the public sphere as the thing that is most valued in leadership or about leadership. How do you frame that to them?
So I hope and I aspire to frame it with some humility, right? That there's not an answer about leadership, and they should reflect on their own lives of who has inspired them, who has exercised the type of leadership that they have been moved by, because they're in this too. And I talk about the leaders who've inspired me. That's not to say that's the only effective model of leadership in the world. I think we want to understand, frankly, I think we need to understand what might be considered pathological leadership styles. I don't want students to necessarily copy them and mimic them, but we should understand people who perhaps are not always well-meaning, are not exercising leadership to maximize human flourishing, but they're exercising leadership perhaps for small groups of people to advance the interests of perhaps just their tribe or just their personal financial situation. And the leadership I want to be inspiring is leadership that is pro-social, leadership that's about flourishing the broadest for all living beings, not even just human. How do we actually live in a way and lead in a way that maximizes the potential of this earth to sustain life for forever, or at least as long as we can think, right? I don't think that is necessarily the dominant paradigm right now. But I do know there are many people who do lead and aspire to lead in that way. And I think, so I hope I approach this question with a level of humility that I don't have the answers, but let's look at, from our own experience first, what has worked. And then we can actually think of the people who've led or have held positions of leadership. Now, the problem with those models, they tend to perhaps overemphasize leadership by males and leadership in military or sports or those other things, when oftentimes it's the school director who might be male or female, or the orchestra director or the artist who are finding ways to disproportionately impact the course of human events through leadership, but not in one of those traditional institutions. And, you know, I believe that there are artists, there are teachers who've actually done quite a lot to change the world for the better. So can we identify those moments of leadership? We'd like to say at the Batten School, lead from anywhere, right? To emphasize it's not about your position or your authority. It's about a choice you can make at some point today to take responsibility for yourself and others in making or managing change. How do you want to make that choice? And you know, you might be biased towards certain models of command and control, and a choice means I got to deepen my voice and stand taller because that's what leadership means. But actually, maybe the real effective leader is the one who asks the provocative question. Like there's a colleague who's going to be joining me on the Batten School faculty soon. I was talking to him recently. We were talking about artificial intelligence and the newer large language models and ChatGPT and other tools. And they're going to have the answers. The real talent that we need to develop, the real skill is to come up with the right prompt. Right? That's going to be what's really going to differentiate the role of human leaders going forward is who writes better prompts, right? Who knows how to actually use these machines in a way that gets us the information that's actually meaningful, useful, applicable, helpful, true.
Yeah, true would be good.
That's going to be a real differentiator.
Yeah, I've heard you say that changing habits of thought and behavior is the work of leadership. And to me, that implies, and I think this is what you were part of what you were saying when you said that, is yes, it's that asking questions, yes, it's that listening, but also embedded there is some idea about relationships and relationality and the relationality of leadership. How do you talk with your students? How do you talk with folks about that that element of leadership?
Well, really, it's wanting them to think about what is the relationship, right? Because how you lead among a group of friends may be very different than how you lead among a group of skeptics, right? And so you can exercise leadership in both contexts. There's not, again, there's not one model of relationship for every leadership dynamic, right? But I think a more effective leader will be paying attention to what are the motivations of the people in this group. Now, are they likely to to work with me because they feel some identity based on friendship, family, racial identification, or based on hierarchy? I always follow the dean when he says something. What is the nature?
I'm sure everybody always follows when you say something.
Of course.
You're the dean.
But what's the nature of it? Is it and there may be some groups where the way I need to lead is I need to actually humanize myself. I need to tell you about my family and about some of the experiences I've had and some of my pain and show a lot of vulnerability, because that's where we're going to build that trust. There may be others where that would actually be a counterproductive strategy. And actually, that group really needs to, okay, there are three things we're going to get done today. We're going to have the A team, the B team, and the C team, and they need real clarity of instructions. It's not so much about bonding as clarity, right? Now, I don't always know what a situation requires. And that's where some of the jazz comes in, right? You start leaning in the key of A, thinking it's all about like the affect, and you realize, oh, I got to pivot to the key of D and talk with data now, because this group, the way their mindsets, their orientation, their habits of being in groups is they need the cold hard facts, whereas this group needs stories and narrative and personal things. And I think leaders often have to experiment with both, and that's why I'm sure you've given lots of great speeches, and you're probably going to have some aspect of data for the data seekers and stories for the narrative seekers, and perhaps even relating to certain forms of authority, or quoting sources that are authoritative sources that people and find different ways of building that still fundamentally a relationship, and a nuanced, multifaceted relationship. And sometimes it may be the base of things that I have a hard time understanding, charisma.
Mm.
Well, I think that we in our lifetimes, we've seen presidents who've actually managed to have a lot of charisma, either Barack Obama, for whom we worked, or Donald Trump. Both have charisma. And it's an interesting feature, the fact that, it's people seem to oftentimes can show a level of affinity for them, not on a rational basis, but an emotive sense. I remember people who wanted to like touch President Obama. I found that's hard to understand. That we need to touch. I have no desire to. I like touching people, but that was never my relation. It was his ideas, and it was the way he communicated things, but I was aware of this thing called charisma, and we see that also with the former president Donald Trump.
You and I have talked over the years about the value and complications of diversifying, as in the person of ourselves sometimes, diversifying the leadership ranks. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about and talk about the importance of diversity in leadership and diverse leadership within the context of the Batten School.
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to get your thoughts on this too, because you've been in large organizations that have really prioritized bringing in diverse voices, diverse perspectives, diverse ideological views, different geographies and races and backgrounds. And part of the work, I think, is, from my experience, you got to fill the room with people.
Yeah.
Right. You got to bring in new voices, and you're not always going to get a perfect set of perspectives there. But you got to start somewhere, right? So, and with a level of focus and discipline and deliberateness, that we're going to bring in some people who've gone to different schools, some people who've grown up in different communities, some people who've, by virtue of how they might appear, have been on the margins of different groups more often. And we're going to value and encourage and welcome those voices and do our best. And it's not always easy to make it safe for those voices to be heard and to encourage them. And one of the things that I've experienced, the more you have that, the more everybody has a space to share, right? It's oftentimes that we think about DEI and it's become this big political football as if it's like this thing out there. The truth of the matter is, it's often a canary in a coal mine. Is this a safe place to work for people who, regardless of their background, are they people willing to bring their full selves to work? That's not only a question that's relevant to people from marginalized backgrounds. That's a question for every single human being I've ever worked with. So that's, I think, our challenge as leaders is to bring them into the room and then make that a room where they can thrive. Until at some point, it's not a there in the them, it's a this is our room, right? This, and I try very hard here at the Batten School. I want to create a we the people population so that we actually represent we the people with all its diversity, regional diversity, religious diversity, economic diversity, perspectives. Because I think that's where the leadership is most important. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, as you know, this is now also a core commitment of the Luce Scholars Program. The Luce Scholars Program, which is now in its 50th cohort, has always prized diversity of professional ambition, diversity of interest. But it was never a program, let's say, only for future diplomats or only for future business people. It's always been, from the beginning, includes artists and filmmakers and architects, as well as business people and doctors and on and on. And you see that over the course of the 50 years of cohorts. At the same time, in part because of the time when it was created, it always had until recently a structure of nominating institutions. So you had to have gone to or be nominated through one of these institutions. We asked the institutions themselves to narrow down to, let's say, 3 people who they were going to nominate, right? So that creates a kind of a series of funnels, which frankly, we looked and we thought, well, that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't align with our values. It doesn't align with the intentions of the program overall. And it doesn't align with the kind of leadership cohorts that we want to make possible in the world. And so we, a couple of years ago, we decided to move away from that as a model. It's now an open competition. We really want people from a diversity of institutions, a diversity of disciplinary backgrounds. We also want people who are not just graduating from college, who are a little bit further on in their careers. It's still a relatively speaking, early career program. We raised the age to 32 as the ceiling, but also within 3 years of your BA. So if you go back to school later in life and you're making a pivot, we want to encourage and support that. My experience is that those people have extraordinary leadership skills because they have incredibly deep experience and life experience. And we want to help them to have a new life experience if that's where they're headed, and have an immersive experience in Asia if that's something that is going to add to their capacity to help lead all of us from wherever they sit. So in my view is always that you want to open the funnel as opposed to narrow the funnel. And our job as a philanthropy, not just in the Luce Scholars Program, but across everything we do, is to open the aperture, to open the funnel, to widen the networks, not to just turn to the people we know, but always to fling open the doors as widely as we can, so that we can distribute our limited resources in a way that is going to enhance diversity. It's going to enhance access.
Right.
And that's what I hope I'm able to do anywhere I happen to be privileged enough to work. And
Are you starting to see results on that of?
Absolutely. Yes, yes. And, always more, right? Yes, and yes, we've seen an enormous shift and there's more to go, right? There are thousands of colleges and universities in the United States. There are many, many people who would benefit from this program, and not just that they would benefit themselves, but the world would benefit from them having gone through this program, having had this experience. That's why we fund it. That's why we support it. That's why we intend to keep doing it. But we just want to keep opening the doors wider and wider to the extent that we can, knowing that we can't send everyone who might want to go to Asia. I wish we could. But we just can't manage all that. So it'll always be a relatively small program. That's part of what enables us to really support the scholars. But we want to make sure that the doors are open wide on the front end.
So earlier in your distinguished career, you were a college president. How much were you able to, or how much did you try, and what was the context there for increasing the presence of diverse voices among the faculty and the students? And part of this question is, what is leadership like in a college versus foundation, and how your strategies might have to be different in both contexts?
They're definitely different. I mean, before I worked, I was president of Bennington College. Before I was president at Bennington, I worked at Arizona State University for almost a decade. And so that certainly informed my experience. ASU is committed to access and excellence, and that the two are not in contrast. They're not even in tension, that they're actually complementary. And as you know from your tours around higher ed, that is not the norm. And it's not the historical orientation of most colleges and universities.
One of the things I love so much about ASU's mission is this notion that we're going to define success by how many people we include and educate, as opposed to what many schools do, which is how many we exclude in the process. That's
right. And that's been true from the beginning of President Crow's tenure. I came there with him to work with him on that mission. And I'm incredibly proud of what they've done and to have been affiliated with it at all. So I think that requires a rethinking of not just the threshold, the doorway, but the whole building, right? You have to think about the whole structure, the whole infrastructure of support. Because when I moved to Bennington, we used to talk about the difference between being admitted and being invited. Right. So like think about, I don't know about you, Ian, but there were some times in my younger days when I would go to some places that might have a velvet rope outside. Right. And I might hope to get in under that velvet rope without having to wait on the line. Right. And there is a real difference between feeling like you were invited in and feeling like, well, you got to wait on that line and maybe you'll get your turn. And then also when you get to the front, they're going to kind of look you up and down and they're going to decide whether they're going to let you in or not. right? That's a very different feeling, just to take it out, to take it in a completely different context. And you can, fill in the blank for that anywhere, sort of the VIP feeling, even the feeling of like boarding an airplane, you get to go on first or you got to go on last, and you're not going to get to put your bag in the overhead, right? So all of those small.
But the Dalai Lama says we're all the same.
Well, he says we're all the same, except for when you're in like main cabin, in the
Right,
back versus up even in the like extra comfort seats.
It's the hierarchy is everywhere.
Hierarchy is everywhere, right? And I don't know that it's not particular to the United States. There's hierarchy everywhere. In the US, which I can speak to more fluently, it's built into all kinds of things. It's true everywhere, may take slightly different forms. And it's not necessarily, in some cases, I think, hierarchy per se that's the problem. In other words, it's hard for me sometimes, and maybe this is just the age and generation that I am, to imagine everything with a completely flat structure. Like, I think about the situations that I've been in, for example, when I worked in the Obama administration, or when I worked at Bennington College, right? There's a crisis, or at ASU, anywhere really for that matter. There's a crisis. Somebody has to make the decision, and somebody has to organize the people, right, to deal with the crisis. And so you have to have those kinds of structures either available or in place, and you can't make them, I'm all for improvisation, but some things you want to have practice beforehand, right? You don't want to make them on the fly. There's a fire. You don't want to think like, oh, well, let's improvise. Who's in charge here? I don't know. Who calls the fire department? I don't know. Let's figure it out while the building burns, right? But, back to my earlier point, I think thinking about the whole structure, the whole pathway and experience that people have as they come into an institution, as they come into an organization, as they come into a community, and asking ourselves to listen to the people who are having that experience about the way the experience affects them, rather than assuming from the jump that we know how to fix it. Back to what you said about asking questions. Often in academia, I think we're very well trained to identify the problem, but what comes right after that? Let's figure out the solution. But the process of figuring out the solution, whether that's inclusive or not, who gets to make the decision, how those conversations are managed, that to me is one of the real nexus areas of leadership.
And is there an experience from your time at Bennington where you were able to really change the discussion to be about invitation as opposed to just admission?
So we did that in admissions. We made a real effort to shift that conversation to be not just that Bennington was for a particular kind of student who already saw themselves in a particular kind of way, but to reorient our own language about who is a Bennington student, which has implications about what message we're sending about who deserves to be there, who would fit there, and how we would support them. And so we did diversify both socioeconomically, geographically, as well as ethnically and racially. We diversified enormously the student body, and frankly, more slowly, the faculty and the staff. I think the question, again, of who gets to be in these institutions and under what circumstances is an ongoing live question, and it's a forever question. And I agree with you that I hope someday we're not looking to say, that's them and this is us and we're on the inside, or they're on the outside, or we're on the outside and they're on the inside. And yet I also believe that institutions have to have that practice of self-reflection on an ongoing basis, because it's very easy to feel like, oh, we did that thing and now we've done it, and so we can turn to something else. But actually it's a habit of mind. It's a practice in the way that meditation or any other thing is a practice that you will never perfect. You'll never be the perfect meditator. You'll never maybe be the perfectly inclusive organization if you stop. I think I remember, I think it was Tressie McMillan caught him on a podcast somewhere, she's talking about Angela Davis and a bunch of young activists saying to Angela Davis that she didn't understand about something. I don't remember exactly what it was. I mean, can you imagine? I can't imagine saying about activism. Like I can't imagine saying to Angela Davis, like, you don't get it. You don't know. You don't know how to fight or whatever. But according to the story, Angela Davis was like, I hear you. You're right. I'm going to integrate that into my thinking. I'm sure she didn't say exactly those words, but that's basically what she said. Like, I'm gonna shift. I'm gonna learn. And that orientation, no matter who you are, right? You're an icon, right? She's an icon. You know, people may agree or disagree, but there's no question that she's an icon.
Right.
That even as an icon, she's willing to say, you know what? There's something new to me there.
Right.
You know,
It's
my
never too late for
experience-
exploratory curiosity.
That's right. Exploratory curiosity all the way down and all the way to the end, wherever the end may take you.
And I assume that the 50th anniversary of the Luce Scholars Program, that's a great invitation to reflect about where you've been and where we're going and how the world has changed and may create new opportunities, new needs for these fellows and new ways of thinking about how we select them, and also how they're going to contribute back to this country, to the world.
Yes, and we've really rethought some of the supports that we provide them. I mean, some of it is possible because things are possible technologically that didn't used to be possible. I mean, if you think about your time in South Africa, where I also made my own kind of year abroad, living in Thailand, you know, standing online for the payphone with the phone card, right? You know, we couldn't have a Zoom conversation, let alone, you know, call your mom or whatever. And so the ability to provide different kinds of support for people is something that we really want to lean into, and supporting each other, right? That's always been a feature of the Luce Scholars Program, from what everyone tells me. And yet there are new mechanisms to do that now, and we want to support and make those possible. But I think the overall pivot towards inclusion and the overall pivot towards embrace of what everyone brings, building on the history of the program, is probably the biggest shift. And I've heard such great feedback from Luce Scholars across all years of how excited they are to see the Luce program really embrace the same values, but rethought for the next 50 years.
And as part of the program, is there deliberate focus on helping people think about the role they play as bridges between cultures, or is that more implicit for them in their experiences?
We don't ask them to be representatives of America or Americanness. We really ask them to be, again, with their listening ears, with their exploratory curiosity in the experience that is presented to them day to day, to do their best, to bring their best selves to that experience, and to embrace it in all of its inevitable bumpiness, uncertainty, all of that. Because resilience is obviously, of course, also an important characteristic of leadership. And living in that uncertainty and change is, well, maybe part of what it just is to be a human today, but particularly if you aim to be a leader from whatever position, being able to be resilient, to pivot, to undertake the kind of improvisation that you were talking about before is essential. And to be able to listen for new things. I think that really where you started is such a key part of what we hope people will get out of their time as Luce Scholars, is being able to listen for new things, being able to think about your own role in a new kind of interaction. Because when you're somewhere you've never been before, in a place that's unfamiliar, everything is new. And to let it be so is a real leap of faith. So I'm enormously admiring of the Luce Scholars, and that they throw themselves into the experience, and that they really want to explore. They really are curious. And my hope is that they cultivate those habits over a lifetime. Some of them end up going into US-Asia relations or something related to Asia, but many of them don't, but they take that experience with them in ways that I think, even by their own reports, are somewhat unpredictable. And that's okay. That's great, because life, turns out, is unpredictable.
Yeah, I think that's in some ways the unpredictability of life is exactly, I think, the leadership opportunity, right? If we knew exactly how things were going to go, we could actually program someone to actually make
Or
all the
AI, maybe, yeah.
right, yeah. But precisely because it's going to be unpredictable, and because we as people, even ourselves, are unpredictable to ourselves sometimes. that's where the humanity lies. That's the poetry. That's the art. That's why as there will be enormous work on artificial intelligence, but it's our natural intelligence perhaps that comes again rooted in this curiosity and the openness and asking questions. That I'm hoping that the Luce Scholars Program and the Batten School together are both kind of nurturing in people, supporting them, provoking them a little bit to kind of to look for what's surprising, what's different, what's an
I
opportunity.
remember I was so thrilled when you called me and let me know that you were going to be leading the Batten School, because having known you for as long as I have and knowing what I know about your approach to leadership, I thought, oh my goodness, let's hope that there are many, many more leaders like Ian in the world 4, 5, 10 years from now, because I'm so admiring of your approach and the way that you think about these things and your willingness to be vulnerable and open. And I think that model is such an important thing for students.
Well, thank you for saying that. Part of the appeal to me to join the board of the Henry Luce Foundation was knowing that it's playing a role trying to cultivate these same leadership tendencies and habits of humanity, of really heart-centered, thoughtful people who are not afraid to go to new places, not afraid to dive into new communities, unsure of where it's going to lead. No blueprint for where it's supposed to lead. But we know that it enriches their lives and it enriches their potential to contribute to the thriving of our species.
Yeah, knowing exactly where you're going. What's the fun in that?